Good morning. I'm sorry about my voice. It was the first cold day this autumn some days ago. I was asked to speak something general about early towns in medieval Livonia. Or it means more or less about the beginnings of urbanization in medieval Livonia in the general framework of the Baltic Sea area. I try also make some remarks about the historiographical aspects of this topic. Here you can see some data about emerging town life in medieval Livonia. As you already know, the numbers or the data of years, they are just very how to say it? They are not very serious about the beginnings of real town life. There are in some cases hypothetical dates of the town charters. In several cases, it doesn't mean that the real town already existed, but still there were quite many of towns in medieval Livonia created or started in the 13th century, and one can also say that all real towns of medieval Livonia emerged already in 13th century. There are some more in 14th century. Only notable maybe town of them was Narva, but still the all bigger towns, including the three main towns, Tallinn, Tartu, and Riga, were emerging in 13th century. The history writing of Livonian urbanization has been, it's possible to divide it maybe in three groups. First, one could call as innocent historiography, so typical for 19th century. It's just repeating the written sources when the Chronicle of Henry of Livonia declares that Bishop Albert created in 1201 the town of Riga, so it is in this way, and we have nothing to comment on it. Another school, so to say, would say that the Livonian town, it was a German town. The meaning of German town has already also changed during the times, but it can be seen in positive sense in this way that it was a civilizing factor of Germans. German merchants came to the east and created the town life. The trade were interested in contacts to Novgorod and Pskov and other Russian centers, and starting to Europeanizing, Christianizing, civilizing of Estonian and Latvian native population. Or it can be seen also in negative sense. In this way, the German town was some mean of oppressing natives, colonizing factor, and the colonizing has a real negative meaning. And the third school, so to say, is Estonian and Latvian one, trying to show that the town life in some way existed already before the German conquest in the 13th century, before the Crusades. And this kind of creating this kind of hypothesis became prominent in 1930s and had a very clear political context. the two very well-known examples are the paper by Baltic German historian working in Latvia, Leonid Arbuzov, published in volume Baltic in 1939. Arbuzov criticized the hypothesis by Latvian prominent politician, historian Tentelis, that the beginnings, as Riga has pre-German beginnings, there was town life in Riga already before the Crusades. This meaning could be somehow dangerous for position of Laakman in Latvia, so his article was published under the name of Heinrich Laakman, his Estonian Baltic German colleague, anonymously. And another case, it's Erkki Russapea who has published about it. There was the excavation in Tallinn during the Stalinist time, where the Hanseatic culture was interpreted as evidence of existence of Russian-like pre-German town. So it has been politically important to declare in some cases that the town life was not the result of crusades or result of conquest. So maybe the general question of the Baltic urbanization or Livonian urbanization in the context of the history of Baltic crusades could be not so much what was the time of the emergence of the town life, pre-conquest or post-conquest, but rather post hoc or propter hoc. It means, are the towns in Livonia a result of conquest, or did it just happen after the conquest or during the conquest? So, what is the context of the Livonian towns in the general history of urbanization of the Baltic Sea area in the 13th century? So, certainly we can also discuss what does the town mean. There are, in some cases, clear difference between town and non-town, in this sense that town has a charter, but outside the German-like legal culture, this definition doesn't work. There are concepts of proto-town or early town and so on. But it should be something different, but still, there are the towns, town beginnings in the Baltic Sea area in 13th century. So I hope this slide can demonstrate that it was a very similar processes in all the territory, not only in Livonia, not only in Russia. So there were some general developments which were not directly connected to crusades and political changes. Or another table about Danish towns founded in the Middle Ages. As you can see, the most of them are from the 13th century and early 14th century as well. So I'll declare that from my opinion, the connection to the political history, crusading history, or conquest, or German immigration is in the general Baltic Sea area not so clear as it likes or as it looked like in the Livonian case, when traditionally conquest, political change, social change, and the foundation of towns are connected in the historiography. Another context of how the foundation of Livonian towns has been treated in history writing is a German trade. And German trade in Livonian case mostly means Russian trade. So the traditional history writing connects the emerging Lübeck trade or German trade, trade of the merchants from northern Germany and Westphalia, with their interest to have contacts to Russia, mostly to Novgorod. The emerging Hanse has also been connected to the trading interests towards Russia. Interest to have better access to Russian market and its supplies like furs and so on. And the typical steps in this history, there are the beginnings of Lübeck in 1159, the famous Artenburg privilege of the Heinrich de Löwe in 1161, and the creation of German yard or kontor in a German St. Peter Church in Novgorod in about 1190. The Gotlandic or Scandinavian yard existed already since the 11th century there. This way of interpreting the historical developments has gone to this way, even that, like it was written by Paul Hansen in 1940, the interests of German merchants are the main cause of Baltic crusades. Merchants needed the better access to Russian market. It was the reason why Baltic pagans had to conquer. The territory was made German. Law and order were put into Livonia, and so the merchants had the better access to Russian market. However, this story looks a bit differently when we are looking this from the Russian side. But how the Russian trade looked like before the 13th century. It's not very easy to discuss because there is very few written sources about it, some fragments of Russian chronicles mainly. But when we look at the Novgorod in the 12th century, there are many architectural monuments built in the 12th century. It was really, it means that there was economic resources were there to build big churches. Quite big number of the most prominent older architectural monuments in Novgorod are originally from the 12th century. In 12th century Novgorod, when you read the Novgorodian chronicles, you can see that the merchants played a prominent role in Novgorod in 12th century. Merchants are mentioned in the text as founders of churches. Merchants are in some cases named by the name in political issues. But this development stops in 13th century. It means that merchant position in Novgorod should be more prominent in 12th century than during the later period. And certainly there are many archaeological evidences of foreign trade in Novgorod, also in 12th century, quite often Scandinavian trade. So it means that the Baltic trade and trade at all had very prominent role in the life of Novgorod already before the German measures came. And about the Baltic trade, there are 2 or 3 pushback documents registering the trade of leaves in Novgorod. And certainly there are evidence of the Chronicle of Henry of Livonia. For instance, the German merchants already before founding of Riga had trade contracts to Pskov and made trade trips to Russia. Then what happens in 13th century? It was a famous British historian of medieval Rus, John Fennell, who titled his book The Crisis of Medieval Russia. It was a book about the 13th century. He had in his mind mostly the political crisis, Mongol invasion, collapse of the former political system of principalities. But during the last couple of decades, the Russian historians and archaeologists started to use this term in more broad sense. There are evidences about the many changes in the life in Rus in the 13th century, which can be titled as some kind of crisis. Most prominently, for instance, the agrarization of the Rus. It means the decline of urban life, the agrarian side of production became more prominent, relatively more prominent. In 13th century, what happened, it was the devastation of Novgorod urban territory. There are parts of town territory of Novgorod which was settled in 12th century and abandoned in 13th century. The number of birchbark documents in Novgorod in 13th century is decreasing. And in this context, what's important, it all happens before already, or starts to happen already before the Baltic Crusades. And in Russian context, it starts already before the Mongol invasion. There was a collapse of town life in Rus, in some parts of Russia and medieval Rus, so including modern Ukraine and Belarus, really happened due to the Mongol invasion, destruction, and war. But the general processes of some kind of changes in economic system and political system started already before, and they cannot be connected to some special political event like the Mongol invasion, or in Baltic case the Baltic Crusades. For instance, Russian archaeologist Elena Rubina, some already, I think, in 1970s or early 80s, published a book about archaeological evidence of Novgorod trade, and she uses a very simple explanation in every case, Baltic Crusades. When there are some kind of items which were more numerous in 12th century than in 13th century, she wrote, yes, it's due to the war in the Baltics. It was an obstacle for trade, and there are some evidences which are more numerous in 13th century than in 12th century. She wrote that merchants had their commercial interests, they didn't consider the war, they continued their trade without any trying to go over the political events. So the Baltic Crusade as a general explanation for everything. When we really think about the military aspects, then really during the 13th century the war was almost always there in this area. But there were many military conflicts between Rus and Estonian Latvian territories already in the 12th century, before the Crusades. There were quite regular raids from Sweden, or generally Scandinavia, to Neva territories, Ladoga, so it's a gate to Novgorod. And in southern parts of Baltic area, the war continued already in the 14th century. The Preußenreisen, the continuous crusading against Lithuania, and also in Karelia, there were major military conflicts in Karelia and Neva area around 1300. So we can ask, did the war really present an obstacle for trade and urban life? We should, I think that remember that the medieval wars was not this kind of total war like we know about the modern times. The number of soldiers were rather small, and the territories directly affected by war were rather small. So I think the direct influence of war couldn't be estimated too high.
May I have a small remark? In this context, what does it mean, living war?
War against lives. So in Riga and Gauja area. But still, there was some so to say crisis in Russia. It seems to be been overcome in the last decades of 13th century. Maybe one evidence of it is a new start of stone buildings. The stone building stopped in Novgorod and maybe also in Pskov already before the Mongol invasion, and Mongol invasion didn't affect directly Novgorod and Pskov. The new starts happened maybe in sometimes 1280s in Novgorod, maybe a bit later in Pskov, but still we can generalize that it is the last decades of 13th century. And in many ways, probably this development also reflects in Livonian urban development. We have more numerous sources about trade from Livonian, emerging Livonian towns in the late 10th century and so on. So, what happens in the 13th century Baltic Sea area? I would say that it's not only political reorganization and not only crusade, not only conquest and colonization. One can ask what were the advantages of German merchants, because why they were so successful. A typical answer has been new meaning of transportation, Koch, but still maybe the more important element could be the personal network in the western part of the Baltic Sea area and northern sea area in Australia, because the Hanseatic trade mostly used the personal connections between trade partners living in different towns. It seems that the Russian merchants, for instance, didn't have this kind of network. And from the 13th century on, the Novgorodian merchants, it seems they were not independent entrepreneurs. They were just acting for landowners, boyars, and traded with their capital and their products. So it means it's also some, it's evidence of some kind of agrarization of old Russian society in the 13th century. So maybe we can, in this context, say that yes, there was some kind of boom of urbanization in medieval Livonia in the second half of the 13th century. Maybe the exception are Colonia and Eastern Latvia. They were the territories of medieval Livonia, where in Colonia the towns were small and emerged only later on, and in Eastern Latvia there were no towns. But it was really though that the territories were affected by the war, also in the second half of the 13th century, so the reality outside conditions were not so favorable for emerging town life. But this emerging of urban life should also have impact on the general population of the territory. There was really need for rural products, for instance. The towns needed to towns had need for food. Probably there was a direct impact for production. We know that the arable territory did expand in Livonia after the conquest. Maybe the emerging town life was also a factor here. And Lemus has written about how the monetary economy starts to penetrate into rural areas in the late 13th century. And from the towns. So there are connection between town life and local life. So probably the town was also for native population opportunity. Livonian towns had immigrant population not only from Germany or Scandinavia, but also the native population came into towns, and there was also immigrants from Russia, for Lithuania. So it means that there was really some kind of number of opportunities for immigrants from the quite big area. And it seems that also in this time the Russian trade was in somehow reorganized. There are new agreements between the emerging Hanse or German trade towns and Novgorod from the 1260s, which remained some kind of basis for legal basis for Novgorodian trade for longer period. And maybe also some kind of change is indicated by the fact how the Lübeck started to be the real center of Baltic Sea trade during the second half of the 13th century, replacing Visby, who had this goal earlier. So what I tried to say generally is that I'm rather supporting the idea that the founding of Livonian towns, emerging of town life in Livonia, it really happened post hoc and not really propter hoc, and the connection to political events, crusade, conquest, colonization, the typical Stichwörter used in this context. it needs some further discussion.
Questions? Is there any questions from the auditory? If not, then
I will ask, how do you translate it? The ships reach Novgorod. They are deep in port, yeah, and it was a river trade. Were they overloaded, the cargo was in some places?
They were, in later on, this reloading happened in Tallinn, in Narva, and in nearby estuary. We do not know, but in the 12th century there was also some Russian ships sailing on the Baltic Sea, at least in the mid-12th century. There are once Russian ships mentioned in Denmark.
They were not flat in the water like Viking ships or Russian ships.
I think they were also the big Viking ship type ships, or something like that. But still, even when you can use the bigger ships on your way to Novgorod, there are in Volkhov some places where the goods needed to be reloaded anyway.
There is quite a huge technical problem in the Lake Ladoga because the weather in Lake Ladoga is so stormy that in the 18th century there was a problem how to reload in the beginning of the river canal. So there is the reason why they built a huge number of canals. So especially in this time it is a more severe problem than in the 18th century.
Probably, maybe they had not so rush in these times. They had time sometimes to wait.
What's up?
so. Any other questions or comments? I do have one. I was going to ask what is your opinion concerning the emergence of towns, but you answered it in your very few last sentences. You are from party of post hoc, meaning that the towns emerged around the mid-13th century and later on. Then the question is, what happened during the second quarter of 13th century when the Estonia was conquered already and we had here Christianized world? What happened during the 30s and 40s if towns emerged in 50s and 60s?
Yes, it was some kind of generalization. I do not declare that because there wasn't anything before. Certainly there was something before.
But we don't know.
But we don't know, yes. So so my idea was rather that when you think that there was almost nothing in 1200 and there was 2 or 3 for this time rather big towns in around 13th century, then the very rapid development rather maybe still happened during the second half of the century. Maybe the exception is Riga. It seems that it was a quite town-like town already in the 20s.
Exactly, had a town wall already in the 20s, so it means that it was really similar to Lübeck as a boom town.
Yeah, so Riga boomed up probably a bit earlier.
But otherwise I would say that also the beginnings of small towns at least partially goes back to the 30s and 40s, for example in case of Lihula, where we have some evidence from the 30s, late 30s and then 40s, and I suppose it might be case in other towns as well. The trouble is it has not been enough thoroughly researched yet, and sadly written evidence is so sparse that it doesn't help us further.
Yes, and so my context was in the first line that when typically think that the reason of Livonian towns was Russian trade. So what was the period when the Russian trade could really boom again?
exactly.
But still, it doesn't mean that there was no trade before. So it's a very famous evidence of Novgorod Chronicle about the great famine in Novgorod in 1230, and it's a especially written down in chronicles that the German makers came to this grain and helped the town.
But on the other hand, trade can't be just the main thing. There are also other aspects as well for the existence of towns. This is just one of the explanations. Any other questions?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to know about how to define a town. For example, with Reval here, we saw three different dates. 2019, it was when Danish king Valdemar Ser, he won this battle here and started to build a stronghold. When we had 1238, when in Stensburg peace treaty, this place is mentioned as Civitas, and then 1248, when this city got Lübeck city law government, and also in between we have a date where Almshouse was built here and the kind of urban institutions were born. I mean, mentioning all these towns in old Livonia and northern, nowadays Estonian territory, what is the kind of cut-off point where a place can be deemed to be kind of a city or town?
I'm not qualified to answer.
No.
For that, we could have a special conference.
Oh, yeah.
Not for one day, but
at
least 2 days.
Yeah, because we have rather big settlements like Lihula without town charter. We have town charter without any town. How?
So, no, it was Rockford who built the second stronghold there. Oh no, I mean Stonecastle.